Sorry, I was just setting everything up. Hello, my fellow readers. This is Dark Symphony 777 with another fan fiction review. As always, a link to the story will be in the description below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click on that bell for notifications, and leave a comment in the comment section below on your thoughts on the story. And finally, this is my opinion. My opinion is not indicative of everyone in the world, so please respect that. So, the story we are doing is actually not one story. It's not two stories. It's 4 stories. It is the Walking the Line saga by Starving Lunatic. It is a series of Kim Possible fanfictions, Shigo specifically. And the reason I wanted to review these is, honestly, I remember reading this series a long time ago, like years ago, like around 2011, 2012. And I never got a chance to finish the last story. I remember actually stop reading like halfway through it, and I couldn't remember why. And I'm like, at the end of December, I'm like looking over fan fictions that I want to review, and then I remembered this story, and I remember, hey, wait a minute, I never got a chance to finish that. Maybe I should I'll do that now. I'll do it this year, and review the Walking the Line saga. I will say this a little ahead of time. I did not like the last story. I will explain when I get to it, because I want to talk about the first 3 stories, because One in a Billion is kind of its own thing. It's kind of like for the most part separated from the first 3 stories. Like 1, 2, and 3 are all kind of interconnected, and 4 is kind of its own thing that kind of serves as like a more or less an epilogue, like a really, really long epilogue. And then, like, years later, the author wrote a 5th story, which is like an epilogue to the epilogue. I honestly, it's kind of complicated, but let me explain. Let's start with the plot. The plot is AAU, i.e. alternate universe, that kind of has Shigo as a cop of Ghost City. So instead of being Draken's little sidekick, she's basically her own woman. She works in the police force. She's part of the special police force that deals with like super bad guys and like monsters and stuff like that the regular Ghost City police force can't really deal with. And she's best friends with Betty, Dr. Director, and she kind of goes home and one day, and then she comes across a random box in her house. She's very ordinary. And she's like, okay, what is this box doing in front of my house? I didn't order anything. So she kicks the box and gets ready to move it, where she hears a noise coming from the box. She opens it, and inside the box is Kim Possible. So Kim Possible kind of is more or less the same in this universe. She is still a crime fighter and stuff like that. But she kind of has a special thing where she kind of stays away from Ghost City, specifically because Ghost City does have that special police force. So she kind of has like a thing. It's like, okay, I won't bother Ghost City, and that kind of bridges the entire plot of the first story, because of the simple fact that she's still Kim Possible, but since Kim Possible doesn't operate in Ghost City, specifically because of people like Shigo and the rest of the special forces, she doesn't really enter that area. So Shigo doesn't know who Kim Possible is. So she really doesn't know. And so Kim Possible is like beat up. She was kind of drugged. Shigo kind of brings her in. It's like, all right, I'm going to feed you. I'm going to take you tonight. But then in the morning, you got to go. And so that's what Shigo does. She feeds Kim. She actually brushes her hair, cleans her, because her wrist is like completely bruised. She can't use it. And feeds her. And then waits until the morning, gets her breakfast. Is like, all right, off you go. Kim doesn't want to leave. And she's like, I like it here. Can I stay here? And then Shigo, trying to like get her out of here, makes like a joke suggestion saying, why don't you just be my pet? And thinking, okay, she's gonna go. But then Kim Possible goes, no, I'll be a pet. I'll be a pet. Shigo's completely flabbergasted by that response, and she goes, okay, you'll be my pet. And so basically the entire all 3 stories are basically Shigo treating Kim like a pet. Like an actual pet. They go the whole 9 yards. She buys collars. Shigo buys a leash. They do fetch. Kim acts like an actual animal most of the time. Like when she's getting punished, she runs and she hides underneath the box that she came in. And she's like, "Don't hurt me." But Shigo's like, "Nah, you get out of here right now." Kim even like lays on the kitchen floor to stare at Shigo's, more specifically stare at Shigo's behind, because according to Kim, Shigo has a nice behind, and of course Shigo does have a nice behind. And the story kind of bridges the gap of each story representing a different phase of their relationship. So the first story is more sees them as master and pet. The second story is them kind of becoming friends because at the end of the first story, Shigo finds out that Kim is Kim, and Shigo wants Kim to be set free because a big thing in Kim's story arc is that Kim doesn't know what she wants to do with her life, and she's tired of these expectations of being raised by her family being all these pets, and all these expectations kind of bearing down on her. So she specifically decided to stay with Shigo as long as possible because of the simple fact that she can be herself. She can be a goofy, unrepentant, lazy goofball. And Shigo's like, because of the specific fact Shigo doesn't know who Kim is until the very end of the story, Shigo just puts up with it because it's like, well, you're an idiot, you're a dumbass pet of mine. So who's to say, And then she finds out she's smart, so Shigo lets her go because you gotta actually learn to do something, you gotta actually get your own career and stuff like that. And then the second story comes along. She does go to college, which just happens to be in Go City because she actually wants to be a scientist, but she doesn't know what she wants to do specifically. And so she goes back to Shigo. Shigo basically does like the humble thing, saying, "All right, you're gonna be back, but you're still gonna be the pet." And Kim's like, "Ah!" And then of course they go along with emotions. Although it does feel like there's something more in that story. We do get to meet more of the characters that show up throughout the story. But mainly, these first two stories are just mainly exclusively Kim and Shigo. Granted, in the second story, Draken does show up, around half of the story. I'll talk about Draken once I get to characters. I'm still talking about the plot. And they become friends. But then in the third story, everything changes when Kim does slowly fall in love with Shigo. But Shigo wants to keep the camaraderie of them being a master pet. She understands there's more to it, but she's still determined that she is straight, because that's the big thing in the third story, that she's straight, and she's trying to maintain that idea that she's straight, but she has legitimate feelings for Kim. And then at the end of the story, they do fall in love, and they do start going on dates and stuff like that. The fourth story has them get married. They adopt a kid. They get one of Kim's friends, Felix, inseminate her. They have kids, and then the entire story kind of turns inside out because the author puts the kids front and center, and everything kind of falls apart in that story. Let me explain. So, oh boy, this is why I really didn't want to look. When I first started reading the last story, I was like, fine, this is good. It's same old. Nothing's really changing. And then they got the kids. And then I don't know why. And this is my opinion. This is honestly my opinion. Everyone's going to have a different opinion on this. Whether you agree or disagree, that's up to you. In my opinion, once the author added the kids, everything kind of capsized. And it's not so much Kim and Shigo, and then also Betty and Falsetto Jones and Ron and Yori and Monique and Felix having kids. That's not a bad idea. If you're going to go through the whole mileage of everything, it makes sense that it would be them getting married and them having kids and watching those kids grow up. That's fine. The idea is fine. The problem is the execution is completely I can't even, because I didn't even remember why I quit the last story until we got to the kids. And the reason why was because the author made the kids so unlikable. Like, it was impossible to like any of these kids except for Todd. I like Todd. Todd is a good character. He's a good original character that kind of stands out in his own way. But the rest of them, with Ryza and Maya and whatever Ron and Yori's kid's name, Bo, I'll just say Bo, and the rest of them, they are just so unlikable. And then when I started actually reading to them and how they actually behaved, I quickly remembered, oh yeah, this is why I stopped reading this last story. These kids are horribly written. And having unlikable characters is not a new thing, especially in this series, because the whole shtick of Shigo's character in this story is the fact that when we're first introduced to her, she's super unlikable. Like, she's a complete jackass to everyone, literally everyone around her. She threatens to beat everyone up. She actually goes through with it. Everyone is afraid of her. So the author goes out of her way to make Shigo as unlikable as possible. That way, when we were introduced to Shigo meeting up with Kim and then doing the whole pet relationship thing, we see her open up and she starts to mellow out. So it makes sense in context in how the author wrote Shigo as unlikable, but then we slowly started liking her because she started mellowing out and people kind of started actually at least being able to be tolerated by her at least a little bit. With the kids, they basically took Shigo's unlikability and didn't give us the way to make them to give them a way for them to make us like them. So we're left with a bunch of very rude, very crude kids that don't really get any comeuppance for anything because they completely act like spoiled brats. Which makes sense because, in fact, their families are like all very, very gifted and stuff like that. They act very spoiled. Everyone's afraid of them. And they pretty much all act just like Shigo. Like, it's one thing when it's Shigo because that's just one character. Now imagine that as about half a dozen characters. Like, because you got Ryza, which is Shigo and Kim's kid. You have Maya and Aztec, which are just like which are Falsetto Jones and Dr. Director's kids. She has 4 kids, but those are the 2 main ones. You have Bushiden, Bo, I'm just going to say Bo, who's basically Ron Yori's kid, who's basically, who at least comes the closest to become likable because the author tries to do something with him. It just happens at the very, very last chapter, which I'm not going to count. And then you have Ryza, who's Felix and Monique's kid, and all of them act pretty much the same. They act very spoiled, and there is just no way to make the author went out of her way to try and not make them likable. And it's so off-putting when it's one character to be unlikable. Like, a lot of people who like these kind of stories, they're very cynical. I'm just going to say that. And having an unlikable character can work. It worked with Shigo in this very series. Like I said, the whole point of Shigo's character was she was specifically designed to be written as unlikable as possible, but then you go through the motions of her opening up and mellowing out and then slowly becoming likable, both to us, the readers, and the other characters in the series. But it doesn't happen with the kids, which is why I consider, like, the 4th story being more its own thing rather than being connected to the other 3 stories. And not to mention, in the plot for the 4th story, I don't know why, but the author puts in, like, race politics? It came out of left field. Like, the author put in, like, sexuality politics as well as race politics in the 4th story. The sexuality thing, okay, I can give that a pass because Shigo's sexuality was a big part of her character arc, and you know they always made like a big deal about that. That's fine. I can get behind that. I'm fine with that. But in the last story, when they're in high school and they basically have to give a report about their heroes, Maya has to give gives a report about her parents, and she talks about her parents, and she mentions how her father, Falsetto Jones, is a black man. And I'm literally just confused over that. It's like, why did that have to be mentioned? Because when they did it, when Jaden, Kim and Shigo's kid, did it, a lot of people in the story, which is their students, because she did it twice, she talked about it to elementary school kids, and they were mostly confused. Like, wait, you can only have two parents, and they can only be a mom and a dad. You can't have. How is it? It was more confusement because the kids were just trying to figure out how does that work. Well, in high school, they basically insulted Jaden by calling her gay and basically doing a lot of derogatory remarks. That's fine. That worked in the context of the story. But then when Riza talked about her black parent and people started being randomly racist, I'm sorry, I'm just completely confused. It was like, what was the point of this? What was the point about this whole little bit about Falsetto Jones? And for those of you who don't know, Falsetto Jones in the Kim Possible story is basically just a one-off villain that happened in an episode that really only lost because he mainly because they just managed to get away because Falsetto Jones was actually smart enough to kind of avoid the pitfalls of a lot of villains. Like, there was actually a very meta part in his episode where Falsetto actually chains up Kim and Shigo to like a death pit, and instead of walking away, he sits down and watches them, and Kim and Ron are like completely confused, and Ron actually points out, it's like, wait, why aren't you leaving? It's like, and Falsetto Jones goes, why would I leave? And then they literally Kim and Ron look at each other, and it's like, well, the bad guy, whenever they lock us up, they leave. It's like, why would I do that? It's like, I want to make sure you die. And they're just completely confused. Like, this never happened before. Which is actually a pretty memorable moment in my eyes because I just like that whole subversion thing. It worked really well. But again, going back to the whole race thing in the story, it just made no sense. And all I was left was just legitimate confusion. It's like, why is this here? Why did the author have to put random politics? Again, the whole sex thing, the whole same-sex thing, that makes sense in the context of the story. That makes sense. I'm cool with that. Yeah, this only happened for one chapter, but it's bare mentioning over the fact is just why did it need to be here? Like, just really why? Because this never happened at any other point in the story. So why didn't it kind of reeked of wanting to put your own personal politics into the story for the sake of it, and I just don't like that. It's my opinion. If you have a different opinion on that, just fine, put it in the comments. I won't be mad because everyone's gonna have a different opinion. But back to the story. Overall, the story does follow this overall narrative of Shigo adopting Kim as a pet, and then slowly inching their way towards becoming a boyfriend and girlfriend, and then eventually getting married. It's a very slow process. Like, if you count all the words across all four stories, you get around nearly 900,000 words. So it's a long 4-part series. So it's fine. And I like the narrative of always focusing on Kim and Shigo. Like, it never really drags down because because it always focuses on Kim and Shigo. And usually when it focuses on any other character, whether it be director, Ron/Yori, Draken once or twice, it always seems to follow of always having them focus on Kim or Shigo. And that kind of focus is very admirable because this story, I think, I'm actually looking at the page right now. I think this is actually one of her first stories. Because I know she started writing in 2005. Yeah, this is a very old story. Like, beginning of 2006. This is like a 15-year-old story. No, wait. Walk on the Line is, I think, where is it? Where is it? Oh, here it is. Yeah, Walk on the Line was first published in the end of 2005. The author started writing literally November on fanfiction.net. So this is basically her first big thing. And so for having a story this old that is still kind of talked about, I think some people still talk about this series. I don't know for sure. Don't quote me on that. Kind of says a lot on the quality of these stories, because the only story I don't particularly like is the second half of the last story, and that's only because the author didn't make the kids likable, like, at all. Except for Todd. I like Todd. And we even have some mini side plots that occurs throughout the story, usually through the threads of seeing through Kim and Shigo. Like the whole thing with Betty slowly actually falling in love with Falsetto, with Shigo's parents, with Kim's parents, there's like a very big plot line in the second story with Shigo wanting to figure out who she wants to stay with. Does she want to still be Kim's owner, or does she want to go continue on dating Draken? And there's a big thing in the second story about that plot line. And the third story is just mainly just random little arcs that kind of intersect with them, kind of that goes over the course of months that them slowly getting together. And then the last story, halfway through, with the story kind of focusing both on Kim and Shigo and the rest of the parents, as well as the kids and stuff like that. And overall, the plot is done fine. Even when it focuses on the kids, I'm not gonna give it too much bad press, because the only thing bad about the second half of the last story is the kids themselves, minus Todd. But overall, the art, the presentation, and the plot structure and the story structure of the entire story is done well, for pretty much like the most part. I'll talk about like one big problem with the first story when I get to it. Characters. There's really only two major characters, but there is one other character I want to talk about, and that's Draken, because I like the very clever use of Draken in the story, because he only appears in the first three stories. Granted, he doesn't really appear a lot, but he appears enough that he's kind of like the only other major character of the series, even if he only really appears at the very end of the third story. He does appear he does appear more often in the first two stories. But I want to bring special mention to the use of the characters as a whole, because in this series, all the villains in Kim Possible are good guys. Like, granted, some of them were actually bad guys. The story does mention that both Kim and Falsetto Jones were actually villains, but they were caught in the same accident that just made them go, we're just not gonna do bad guy stuff anymore. We'll just be good guys. And Kim became a police officer. Falsetto Jones basically became like a very high end guy that runs like high end dog shows and stuff like that. So basically, they went their own ways. But for the most part, the villains are all good guys. And whenever we saw any of the characters that were canon, that weren't OCs, like we didn't really see a big OC until we were introduced to Shigo's mother, which is Isabel. A neat thing the author did with all the characters is the author made sure to change as much as they could, but still keep their core personality. Like in canon, Shigo is a very ornery person. She's a very snarky, sarcastic person prone to violence. In the story, the author cranks it up a little bit more to kind of give her the presentation of being super unlikable, so that way her character arc works better, of her slowly becoming, thanks to Kim, kind of evening out her personality, somewhat more likable. And this happens with all the characters. It happens with Kim being like a very helpful slightly exaggerates her altruism. With Betty, makes Betty Director more snarky. When we see Dee and Amy, she's basically still Dee and Amy, but she has a sort of like genuine niceness to her. Every single character that we see that's an actual canon character has their personalities tweaked just enough that you can tell that they're still the same, but you can also tell they're different. Not so with Draken, and that's why I love Draken in the series, because instead of doing the same thing the author did with every other character, with Draken, she changes nothing. She changes literally no aspect of Draken's personality, changes nothing about his backstory, nothing about how he behaves and how he acts. She keeps it completely safe, and you may be thinking, well, that's bad writing. Not in this case. Because the reason we fell in love with Draken was the fact he was a very quirky guy who was over the top with his villainy. It's basically like Doofenshmirtz before Doofenshmirtz got created. It's basically like a prototype Doofenshmirtz. And people love Draken because a fun fact is Draken and Shigo weren't supposed to be as involved in the show, but people, including executives, loved the whole shtick with Shigo and Draken so much they literally went, we're just gonna make them the main bad guys. We're just gonna make them Kim's arch nemesis, and because they were so popular. And so, where does that leave Draken in the context of the story? The author took everything that made Draken popular in the canon material, not changing anything about his personality. Instead, she changes everything around him, and he goes from looking like a genuine guy that you actually are entertained by into the most horrible, disgusting, just obnoxious person imaginable. And that actually takes a lot of skill, because despite the fact, that it shows how much the author is skillful, because she's still writing now. She's 2022. She's still writing fan fictions. And Draken is probably the clearest example of the innate talent that she had, because by not changing anything, it shows that she was willing to take that risk, and she had how do I describe this? She didn't change anything about Draken, and instead made all the qualities that made him endearing, turned him into a complete other asset that you really want to die, which does happen at the end of 3. He doesn't die, he loses an arm, but he gets sent to jail because he's trying to kill Shigo and Kim. But it's a testament to the author's innate skill, because at this time she probably wasn't as skillful to writing as she is now, because of all the years that's gone by. But it shows that she does have the quality of a writer by taking what's essentially a big risk, because when people think of AUs, they think of all the characters are at least going to change a little bit. But then you notice Draken, that that literally everything about him doesn't change, period, but he still feels different because of the circumstances of how he's acting around him. That changes our perception over how we think of him. That's really clever. Granted, he only appears in the very end of the 3rd story, and he does appear periodically in the first 2 stories, but it's still a testament to how skillful and how much she's willing to work, that she would take such a big risk and actually make it work. This whole Draken thing was very risky, and she nailed it out of the park, in my opinion. With Kim and Shigo, they have the ability that I had mentioned earlier, and the fact that they are very samey, but they're just different enough that they are completely different people. I did mention enough about Shigo. Again, very ornery, very unlikable at first when we're first introduced to her. That's the first thing we notice about her that separates her from her canon version. Her canon version is very snarky. She does have a comment for anything and everything, but she's still likable. But in this version, it's cranked up to 10, and she comes off as extremely unlikable, but we like her because of how she reacts to how she slowly changes over the course of the story. With Kim, she's very altruistic. She's a very literal genius. She's willing to just give anything off her back, but she wants favors like you scratch my back, I scratch yours philosophy. She's actually something of a nomad. She hasn't really lived anywhere for a long time until she started living with Shigo. And just like Shigo balanced her out, Shigo kind of balances Kim out because now she's slowly like mellowing out too. She's not really as hyper. She can be more true to herself and kind of explore who she is and what she wants to do and who she wants to be. And just like Shigo, it kind of happens over the course of the entire series. And that's very good writing. Grammar errors. There are a couple grammar errors in the first story. Just the first story, it does kind of even out. However, the big thing with the first story is the writing. Now, I can get behind the fact that, her very first big project, it makes a lot of sense that she wouldn't be as knowledgeable with writing as she is nowadays. But I do have to mention the writing style in Walk in Line. Specifically just Walk in the Line. Just the first story. Kim Possible has a very weird writing style in the fact that it flip-flops between showing rather than telling and telling rather than showing. Everyone knows what show don't tell is. It's basically I'm actually having a brain fart right now for what it is. Show don't tell is a writing example used in various kinds of text to allow the reader to experience the story through action, words, thoughts, senses, and feelings rather than the author's exposition, summarization, and description. Show don't tell is not a definite 100% guarantee the story is going to be good. Because some stories do benefit telling rather than showing. And that's what made Kim Possible rather unique in the cartoon medium, in the fact that there are some episodes that actually did the showing and telling, but there are other episodes that flipped the script and relied heavily on telling rather than showing. Like, for example, a very good episode of telling rather than showing telling rather than showing would be the introduction of the seniors. Senior, 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 and Senior, Senior, Junior. And the fact they're very rich, they're very influent, and they're just basically wasting electricity. Kim is like, she's like, oh, they're bad guys, but then she realizes they're just two rich guys that are bored out of their minds and don't really know what to do. And Ron constantly opens his foot, constantly saying, oh, this looks like an evil lair. You can do all this evil stuff. And Senior, 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 being retired, and really only doing the evil thing because he's retired and he just wants to have a hobby. It got to the point where Senior, Senior, Senior is like the only villain that doesn't really mind losing to Kim Possible because it's like even Kim Possible kind of slightly knows that he's really just doing it out of boredom and more as a hobby, and thus really is really just doing something really minor, especially compared to like Draken and Monkey Fist and stuff like that. But the entire episode is loaded with explanation and stuff and exposition and stuff like that because they're trying to tell, because of Ron basically unknowingly convincing Senior, Senior, Senior to do all this evil stuff a try. Albeit as a hobby, but he still does it. And if it just did showing, it wouldn't work as well. But then you have an episode. What was the episode? The episode. I think it was the episode with the microchip. No, that was another example of that was more balanced than anything else. What was the episode with Dee and Amy. The first episode. No, it has to be an episode I remember. Oh, the only episodes I remember is the first one with the first one I told you about, and the one with the microchips. And which episode would work best with show? Oh, Monkey Fist introduction. where we're introduced to like the big storyline with Ron and him knowing and him doing the mystical monkey power and Monkey Fish showing off his feet and stuff like that and coming off like a very affluent guy. That episode relied a lot on showing, mainly to sell the threat that Monkey Fist, compared to like every other villain, is like really, really deranged and really, really serious. And that worked. That made Monkey Fist really memorable. He's not as memorable as Draken and Shigo, but it got the job done. And so what the author was trying to do was trying to balance that showing and telling in a written form. The problem is the author went too far in the telling aspect, and that made the story really, really, really obnoxiously telly. The author does balance it out really fast in the second story. Not immediately in the second story, but you have to actually get into like part way through the second story before you can notice that she does find a balance eventually. But in the first story specifically, it's very telly. It does a lot of telling and just not even barely any showing, because the author is still trying to figure out how to make the story work and stuff like that. You can't blame the author for that. You can't. Because, she was still learning, because at the time, in my opinion, my thoughts, that she was still just learning the ropes and just trying to figure out how things work. But the whole telling thing is worth mentioning. It's really, really bad. Like, you have to get past that first story. If you're not a fan, if you're more a fan of Show Don't Tell, you're not going to like that first story. You're really not going to like Walking the Line. It's just horrendous. But after Walking the Line, and granted, you do have to get into a little bit into on a short leaf. I would have to say around chapter 14, 15. So you still have a little bit to go in for the telling thing, but once you can actually see that the author does eventually balance it, you'll actually be able to tell very easily that she's starting to balance it. And once she does, it's fine. Like the writing, the pacing, everything is fine. Even the pacing in the first story, it works even with the very telling nature, because it's just every couple chapters is just one little story, and then it moves like a certain time frame later into another story. So once that little story is done, it moves on, does another little story, and rinses and repeats. Like, the context of the story changes. Like, there's a part in the third story where she starts hanging out with Junior because she goes like completely kind of worn down. She wants to have fun and relax and kind of going through like her own version of a midlife crisis sort of thing. There's a whole thing at the end of the third story with Draken coming back, realizing that Kim was never related to Shigo, and really her like girlfriend, and he can't really understand that. There's a whole thing in the second story with Draken again where Shigo experiments trying to figure out who she wants, where she takes Kim and then Draken to like a little ski resort and tries to do like little experiments and stuff like that. It happens periodically. Again, the whole context changes every single time, but the pacing does offer a really brief thing, because outside of the first story, it zooms like that, but it works that fast, that really, really fast paced, that comes off as slower than it actually is, because that's more or less the pacing of the entire story. It kind of gives the illusion of being slow paced, but it's actually very fast paced. But it works. The author makes it work really easily, except for the last story, because the author just completely slows down everything more or less to give us time to introduce us to all the child characters and all that stuff. And even that, the pacing works in that. It's fine. So, would I recommend the story? I would recommend the first 3 stories. Granted, I begrudgingly have to recommend the first one. It's very much a product of its time, because, again, the author was still getting used to trying to figure everything out for that first story. You do have to wait until the second story happens for her to just get everything to click better. And the fact that you have to read the first story, otherwise the second on a short lease and the gods must be laughing would make zero sense on anything that happens. You got to read that first story to get to the second and third story. Second and third story are good. They're not great, but they're good. 1 in a billion, on the other hand. If the author didn't butcher those children, I would have recommended it, because everything outside of specifically just the children's personalities is good enough to say, go right ahead. But the children's, how the author wrote the children, especially Jaden and Maya and Riza, specifically, it ruined any enjoyment I would have out of this story. It really ruined any enjoyment. I can't, as much as I don't want to, I can't recommend that for a story. At best, maybe just read the first half of it, have it end when they get married, and then after that, don't read anymore. It kind of pains me to say that, because again, it's just the kids themselves that are just ruining it. If the author made them likable, I would have. I can't. Favorite part? Draken's, not Draken's character. It would actually. Oh, that's a hard one. I know it's from the third story, but I'm trying to figure out what would I put from the third story. I would probably have to say. I would have to say the whole part at the end with Draken, because it really hammers home how well the author handled Draken in the context of the story by just not changing him at all. And that's like the easiest way you can tell that the author didn't change Draken at all. Like even like he's talking about, oh, Shigo is his and stuff like that. It still doesn't change Draken's character at all from his canon to how he is in canon. And that's really clever. That's, again, I talked about it in Draken with the characters. Even then, there's like more characters that do show up periodically. There's Todd, there's the kids. I could have talked about the kids. And I could have talked about Junior when he shows up. Hell, I could have talked about Shigo's mother. Was not really a fan of Shigo's mother. Just not really a big fan of the mother. But that's neither near her there. But other than that, begrudgingly read the first one. You have to make sense of 2 and 3. Wholeheartedly say 2 and 3 are good stories. Skip the 4th story. Skip Gods Must Be Laughing. I can't. What would I change about the story? Honestly, the biggest problem with these stories is the first story is just more product of its time. As much as I would want to see the author go back and fix the story up, it's not going to happen. So, honestly, what I would just simply suggest is the author just not even reboot the entire thing. Just reboot the first story, just to clean up everything. You can do it as like a before and after. It's like, here's what my writing used to look like. Now here's my writing nowadays, and use it as like a showcase of how far she's come in her writing. Now again, she's been writing for 15 plus years. That's crazy. And I think it'd be a cool idea to basically fix up walking the line. I wouldn't really change anything about the on a short lease and Gods Must Be Laughing. 1 in a billion, maybe. If anything, I would just say make the kids likable. That's it. That's just really it. You can go about it in any way the author would want to do. Just anyway. Hell, I would even leave in the whole political thing. It's just make the kids likable. That's just it. But with the first story, that's the only story that needs the only story that needs a heavy overwork. Just fix up clean up the writing, make it less telly, more showy. Give us that balance that Kim Possible is responsible for, of switching between very telling and very showy depending on the scene who you're focusing on. Maybe have it be like when the story focuses on Shigo, have it be very telly, but when it focuses on Kim, have it be very showy. Kind of like the very big balance that the show was good with. Give us a better introduction to Isabel. Like I said, not a fan. I was not a fan of Isabel. I kind of liked her, but then she kind of got on my nerves. The fact that she was literally like the answer to everything. It's like it got really annoying really fast. Show us Draken again, like a better version. Like just with Draken, you don't have to change anything. Show us some of the other characters, we have mention of Monkey Fist and Duff Killigan in the show too, in the story too, but we don't meet them. Give us more context on Dean and Amy. Give us more context of Kim's relationship with her friends. Have Shigo meet her friends a little bit more often. There's a lot you can do with wanting, and a lot of different directions you can take for wanting to fix up the story. Like I said, the rest of the series don't have to touch. At worst, they're just a product of this time. I wouldn't change them. Just leave them as is. The first story, it's the only one that's aged badly, and it's the only one I would really just work on. Just give us like a soft reboot. Show us how much the author has grown over these years, and after that, just leave it as is. Then just go read the other stories. Have fun. So that is my review of Walking the Line Saga. I do like the stories. I do, even with the problems I did say over the course of this review, I do have a soft spot for Walking the Line. It is a good story, not a great story, but the overall saga is good enough that I would give it outside of the second half of the last story. I would say go ahead, read it. You're gonna enjoy yourself, unless you're not a fan of sex. So that's fine. Don't be like Critics United. So that is Walking the Line. I will see you next time. This has been Dark Symphony 777, and cut.